On April the 24th, 1915, British, French, Australian and New Zealand troops began landing on the Turkish peninsula of Gallipoli. Their aim was to knock Germany's ally Turkey out of the war. It was an enormous invasion force, and by mid-afternoon on the first day, there were 8,000 Allied soldiers on the beaches. The Turkish force was heavily outnumbered, but the Turkish soldiers stood their ground. Their bravery allowed time for reinforcements to arrive. Here, as in France, the Allied forces found themselves involved in a war of trenches and stalemate. Cyril Lawrence was one of the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand soldiers. He was at Gallipoli in the heat of the summer when there was a plague of flies and disease, and began to question the British commanders.
Daily now, the men are getting weaker. If only those at home, fed on lies as they are, could see how the men really are. Weak as kittens. One mass of sores, and yet as undaunted in spirit as ever. But that spirit can't last forever, and soon these English idiots will have ruined one of the finest bodies of men that ever fought.
It was decided that the Gallipoli campaign was a waste of officers and men. In January 1916, with 250,000 men killed, wounded or missing, the Allies withdrew. At Gallipoli, Turks had fought Australians, New Zealanders and Britons. This showed that what had started as a European war was now something bigger. A world war. So many men were needed for the war that England and France had to recruit from their colonies. In Africa, newspapers called on people to join up.
The present war is a world war. Without you, your white comrades cannot do anything. Everyone who loves his country and respects the British government, join this war without hesitation.
A West African, Kande Kamara, volunteered for the French army and was sent to fight in France.
There were all kinds of nationalities. There were Fulas, Karanko, Yolunkas, Bambaras, Sanufis, Kese, Toms, Becerra, and a lot more. It was terrible and hard. In the white man's war, you never say I'm thirsty. You never say I'm hungry. You fight and fight and fight until your heart tells you you're afraid.
Over 250,000 black Africans were killed or wounded in the First World War, but their bravery failed to win the respect of either fellow soldiers or the enemy.
We were black and we were nothing. Because of the color of our skins, the Germans called us boots. This hurt every black man because they actually underestimated us, disgraced and dishonored us.
The British commander was Douglas Haig. Many British soldiers remembered him with hatred. One such soldier was Fred Pearson.
The biggest murderer of the lot was Haig. I'm very bitter. Always have been and always will be. He lived 50 kilometers behind the lines, and that's about as near as he ever got. I don't think he knew what a trench was like.
Critics of Haig described soldiers like Fred Pearson as lions led by donkeys. Those who defend Haig say casualties were no higher than those of other countries. They also point out that, in the end, he did what any general has to do. He led his troops to victory. In June 1916, Haig planned an attack along the River Somme. It was to start with a massive bombardment of German positions over several days, which Haig believed would destroy the German lines. Then the Allied soldiers would just walk across no man's land and capture the enemy's trenches. Kenneth McArdle was a second lieutenant from Ireland. Like many of the other soldiers, he was inspired by the number of shells and mines that he saw arriving at the front.
I am not addicted to boasting, but I think if he could see all the guns behind, all the grenades, trench mortars and other stores in front, if he knew how thoroughly ready we are, and if he could conceive how we are longing for the day, I think if he knew, the Kaiser would cut his losses and take poison.
What Haig didn't know was that the Germans had built deep dugouts which protected them from the shelling. On July 1st, 1916, the British detonated the first of 5 massive mines planted underneath the German line. The British soldiers were ready to attack across no man's land. Sergeant Fellows remembered how he felt as he waited for the order to go over the top.
How do you feel as you stand in a trench, awaiting the whistle to blow? Are you frightened, anxious, shaking with fear? Or are you ready to go? No one is anxious to go, my friend. It's a job which must be done. Discipline ensures we obey the rules, though for many their last day has come.
The attack was a disaster.
As we advanced, German shells littered the battlefield with dead and wounded. All around us and in front, men dropped or staggered about. I found a sergeant and, shouting in his ear, asked where were his officers. "All gone, sir," he shouted back.
There were 57,000 British and colonial casualties on the first day of the battle. As night fell, no man's land came alive as thousands of wounded soldiers began crawling back to their trenches. Only in November did Haig call off the battle. There were over 1 million casualties, 620,000 British and French, and 450,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded or missing. The Allied line had advanced by only 5 miles at most. The next year, in 1917, Haig planned a new advance at Passchendaele. He'd learnt some of the lessons of the Somme. The British made better use of their heavy guns. They had more shells, aircraft, and tanks. The troops had become more experienced and used to battle. On Easter Monday, the Canadians, British and South Africans advanced 3.5 miles. The attack was so successful that King George V paid a visit to the battlefield. The fighting resumed just as the wettest summer and autumn in years began. Haig and his commanders ordered repeated attacks across what was now a swamp. Haig didn't realize how muddy the ground had become. He didn't like criticism or discussion, so none of the officers around him told him what it was like. Men would get stuck in the mud and be found dead days later. Whole carts and horses disappeared without trace. 3 months passed before Haig called off the campaign. Haig's forces had advanced only 5 miles. Total casualties for both sides. 500,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The controversy surrounding Haig continues. Whatever his defenders may argue, it's hard to understand how he was prepared to accept such loss of life amongst his men. The trenches were like an alien world. It was difficult, even for the people who lived in them for months, to describe it. Otto Dix was a German artist. He tried to describe what he saw.
Lice, rats, barbed wire, fleas, shells, bombs, underground caves, corpses, blood, liquor, mice, cats, artillery, filth, bullets, mortars, fire, steel. That is what war is. It is all the work of the devil.
British Private Geary wrote about it in his own way.
As far as the eye could see was a mass of black mud with shell holes filled with water. Here and there an horse's carcass sticking out of the water. Here and there a corpse. The only sign of life was a rat or two swimming about to find food and a patch of ground.
For many, the stress of living in the trenches and the constant bombardment was too much. Different soldiers reacted in different ways. Some no longer believed their generals, and their main aim became just to stay alive. Frenchman Louis Barthas was one such soldier. The French commander Robert Nivelle had a new plan to end the war. After a massive build-up of arms, he ordered his troops to attack. This was the reaction of Louis Barthas.
In one night, more cannon shells were fired than in one of Napoleon's campaigns. These men, exhausted, poorly fed, stuck in the muddy trenches, took the order to attack with murmurs. Not everybody can be a hero.
Nivelle's plan was to advance 6 miles. He promised that if they weren't successful in 2 days, he would stop the attack. On the first day, the troops had moved only 600 yards. He didn't keep his promise. The battle went on for 10 days. 200,000 men were killed or wounded. Soldiers like Barthas had had enough. the only full-scale mutiny on the Western Front broke out. At first groups of men, then entire units refused to re-enter the trenches.
Our captain arrived on the scene with a police escort. He tried to speak, but his first words were drowned out by the crowd. Seething with rage, but powerless, he ordered a roll call. A crowd of several hundred soldiers crowded around and mocked these orders. For an hour they hurled abuse at him. Several shots were fired into the air.
The mutiny was the best-kept secret of the war. The Germans never found out because the French soldiers continued to defend their line while refusing to attack. In a way, the mutiny was successful. Nivelle was replaced by Pétain, who improved living conditions and leave arrangements and decided to fight a defensive war until the Americans arrived. But the mutineers were also punished. Hundreds were sent to prison, and 49 ringleaders were shot.
Take me back to dear old Lightning, put me on the great 100-ton. Take me over there.
Allied commanders could see that keeping up their soldiers' morale was important.
I don't care, I shall not see my Vesta. Cuddling up again, we soon shall be.
They arranged their routines so that the soldiers didn't spend all their time on the front line.
Lightning is the place for me. Take me back to dear old Lightning.
They operated on a rotation system. As well as fighting, they would also have time to rest and relax in areas 3 or 4 miles from the front.
Police are turning on, well, I don't care. I shall not see my Vesta.
For a few precious days, the soldiers could forget the constant bombardments, the sleepless nights, and the dirt and squalor of the trenches.